Yebo, siyaphila Nkosi.
Thank you very much. Welcome to Brownback session. We call it BPS, and then your host is Bongomusa Protaska Zondo. We call him BPZ, as it were. We apologize to start late in 8 minutes time. Engineer bebesebhizi bebheka ukuthi kwenzakaleni ukuthi singakwazi ukuconnect. Of course, we know the challenges we face at home of load shedding. I'm glad lapho ngikhona there is no such. But yes, that's not a discussion for today. A discussion for today is something else that is very important for cities, and we would like to appreciate the team that has put this. The rationale behind BPS is to share information on matters that matter the most, and that's what we are doing today. At some point, we used to have this every Friday, but we changed. We now have it once a month. So is to share information and then equally inspire hope on other things, and equally try to build a capable state that manages what it knows and equally aspire to improve every day. And the driving force behind it is that our best is not something that make us enjoy the most, but we always want to be outstanding, and we never rest until our best becomes outstanding. So you are all welcome. On my side is good morning. It's 5 o'clock, not 10 minutes past 5. On your side is 10 minutes past 12. So it's afternoon. May I check if we have got our knowledge aspect and our colleague Anthea from Botswana.
Good morning, Bongomusa. Good morning, colleagues. Thanks.
All right. So it sounds like we are in where I am, and it should be good afternoon at home.
Sorry, afternoon. I'm with you somehow.
All right, Anthea, welcome. Phumzile, I think we should start. You are a first officer, and then I'm your driver in this particular case, your captain. So please, can you give indication if we could take off, and if we have filed all the papers for our flight plan?
Good afternoon, colleagues. I am not Phumzile, but Phumzile
okay.
and I are one. It's very good to have you here on the session. I hope you've got your lunchbox ready. You've got your tea, your coffees, your cappuccinos. If you're on leave, it's already afternoon. You should be having your glass of wine. It's okay if you're on leave, but you've chosen to join us. Colleagues, we can never, overemphasize the issues of sustainability, the issues of resilience for our city, particularly for the city of Durban. We know our level of vulnerability. We have felt it. It's no longer a thing that is something that we should be planning for the future. It is something that we need to start talking about accelerating all the programs, all the action around making sure there is sustainability in terms of how we conceptualize our programs, right from the development of our infrastructure, how we protect it, how we maintain our assets, getting all that's in the row, how we capacitate each other in terms of dealing with what we are facing in terms of the issues or the impacts of climate change, how we ensure that we cushion ourselves in terms of making sure that we have support in all the spaces, whether it's from our national counterparts, whether it's us as a city, whether it's within the province, whether it's within our communities, because I believe that with us working together and having a good governance system where we coordinate our issues of sustainability in terms of how we respond, also when there are these impacts from climate change, we are able to work in the most efficient and most synergized manner so that we we ensure that our response is quicker, and even the impact is minimal and the shocks are minimal because we have capacitated each other. We have a very nice old engine in terms of the relationship we have with all our stakeholders. I forgot business. Business have with our experience, we have seen that we need to bring business even closer to us in terms of how we work and deal with these matters, whether it's pre-planning in terms of disaster risk reduction, whether it's collaboration, and even during the response time, it is very important that we touch base on those issues. We have our star here, our superstar, but she's a very close colleague of ours that we've been working very closely with. We have Miss Anthea Stevens. She's from the National Treasury. She leads the cities support program that looks into the issues of climate and resilience in the cities, looking in terms of planning. She has been with us in this journey for quite a while, even before I joined the Office of the Strategic Management. They have started working in partnership with the World Bank to start looking into, when they started realizing that there's quite a trend that they are observing about Durban in terms of the vulnerability, in terms of disasters. So they started looking in terms of, can't we learn from these incidents and these events? So they started with the lessons learned exercise in 2020, right in the midst of COVID, and they gave us a very, very comprehensive report. And while we were trying to do the implementation, obviously we were hit by the April 2020, but she's been with us observing, such that some of the work that she's been doing with us, she decided that it should be formalized and packaged well through her studies, through her master's thesis. So she's here to share her observations in terms of how we are organized as a city in terms of the climate and the sustainability and the resilience issues around the city. Can I hand over to you, Anthea?
Thanks so much for that introduction, Zama and Bongamusa. I've got slides which I'm going to try and share. I hope they come through. Let me just get them up. Can you see them?
Yes, we can see.
Yes, yeah, they are. Maybe
Yes,
before
they
we
are,
start,
Jesse.
as well, Anthea, Zama, and the team, we had a bit of a challenge in joining, and I do think some colleagues may struggle a bit. We apologize for that. So if you know somebody who's still struggling to do that, the best thing you could now do is just to click register. After that, you get an email accepting you. And then we will then be with us. Otherwise, if the need be, Phumzile, Zama, and colleagues will repeat this at a later stage, but of course it will be repeat on demand. Over to you, Anthea.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And please, I'm hoping my connection stays stable and I don't lose signal and all of that as we go. But thanks for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I'm incredibly nervous, far more nervous than if I was doing this for a normal work purpose. I don't know why. Doing studies at an advanced age is something that exposes vulnerabilities, well, it certainly has in me. But colleagues, allow me to get started, and I'm really looking forward to engagement. And I've also really appreciated eThekwini's openness and welcoming me as a student into your space. And I appreciate your recognition of the importance to learn. I think you are a sort of stellar learning organization, but there's so much that cities beyond eThekwini and the country, around the national that needs to learn from your experience. You very much have been, as I think Bongamusa, you've said, a disaster-prone city, and the country at large would do very, very well to sit up and pay attention to the challenges and the lessons that are happening, at the coalface in eThekwini. So let me get started, and I'm hoping there'll be time for questions. So colleagues, we know, global pressures and transitions, the climate emergency, the energy crisis, COVID, highlight the harsh challenges of addressing systemic risk in an ever more connected world. We know that rapid urbanization concentrates risk and exposes systems that are not designed to cope with these pressures to increasing vulnerability. And the Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction, in fact, is projecting a 40% increase in disasters per year, while recent disasters in South Africa have exposed the risks of current approaches to disaster management that focus on, and this is critical, disaster events in isolation from the wider contextual factors. So these compounding pressures that we face point to a new category of emergency. And this is a category of emergency at a scale and level of complexity that we're only recently witnessing, and which requires, and this is critical, rapid and radical action from both city and national leaders to transcend. So these are what are being called complex emergencies, which are entrenched or deeply embedded in global and or socioeconomic systems. They're often not linked to particular trigger events, but those trigger events can become the straw that breaks the camel's back. But they require drastic action to avoid catastrophe, and they require particular attention to the planning and preparedness phases of disaster management. So eThekwini, we know well, and the challenge, the floods that you faced, the social unrest, COVID, alongside the rest of the world. So my study sought to use particularly the floods of 2022 as a lens to explore how eThekwini and the country can strengthen emergency preparedness and response looking at this through the lens of a complex emergency. So I took 3 questions, which was to understand how eThekwini's incident command systems can be strengthened to cope with complex emergencies, how eThekwini can implement incident command systems that are adapted for complex emergencies, and what reforms are needed at a national level to national policy to ensure that incident command is adapted for complex emergencies. I did this piece of work as a student for the London School of Economics, where I've just completed a master's degree in cities. It was a research consultancy, so generated a report, I think a little bit more geared in the sort of executive style of tertiary education. So it wasn't a full-blown, arduous, lengthy piece of research resulting in a huge stack of dissertation. There's a report that goes with this, which I'm happy to share. And just to note that I received permission from the Chief Learning Officer in eThekwini to work with the city for this piece of work, as well as Strategy Office, and I was very much welcomed in the process, and thank you for that. So my presentation is going to go through 3 big chunks. First, a little bit of context on complex emergencies, a little bit on eThekwini, a city under strain, but then I think hopefully the lion's share on some of the key themes, findings, and recommendations that came out of this work. So complex emergencies were first really noted, or it was first used as a concept in the 1980s. It was defined by the United Nations as these multi-causal, particularly humanitarian crises that required intensive and extensive system-wide coordination and political engagement, often linked to wider instability, whether it's natural disasters, health emergencies, poverty, migration, and so on, but fundamentally nested around conflict. They're crises, when they were first defined, that erode and destroy the cultural, civil, political, and economic integrity of societies, systems, and networks. Addressing these emergencies requires political consensus and innovative ways of working, recognizing a long-term crisis, working beyond immediate disaster relief. But it's this slightly expanded scope of intervention that starts to expose some differences with the mandates of institutions that deal with emergencies in terms of relief, peacekeeping, disaster relief, and so on, as we start to look to societal transitions that are required to get, transition through complex emergencies. So it's important just to be aware of these roots of the concept of complex emergencies, because they are nested in, humanitarian conflict, but they have been used more recently by the Emergency Governance Initiative, which is an initiative that's linked with the London School of Economics, UCLG, that I know eThekwini is working with, as well as Metropolis. So a sort of global group of cities that are trying to grapple with the increasing complexity of emergencies and how to transition. So in terms of, just what make the current working with complex emergencies, characterize, and they stack alongside these other categories of emergencies that we're a bit more familiar with. So the day-to-day that your fire services or your, would deal with, the more typical emergencies that might lead to, some infrastructure damage, bigger human-made disasters, health emergencies that we've experienced, natural disasters, but more isolated. But then we get to these complex emergencies that are very much nested in global crises, global emergencies. So they're characterized by high degrees of uncertainty, a perceived trade-off between lives and livelihoods, political challenges, delayed disasters. So there's a context of disaster, but there's, disasters come as part of the, as part of the wider emergency. So while we're living in a global climate crisis, or most recently global boiling, I think is the most recent term that's been used, we do get these particular trigger events within that, but we need to look at the wider emergency. It's difficult to transition from these. There's a lot of vested interests, as we know well. The trigger moment is not often the emergency, it's the wider crisis. The emergency response paradox, we think we're doing something, but we're not actually tackling the core challenges. And in some cases, there's a limited experienceability. So we go from day to day, we're dealing with the trigger events that come our way, but this wider crisis, the metaphor of the frog, the boiling frog in a pot of water comes to mind. So what do we do, where we start to get this cascading of crises, compounding of risks, really speaks to requiring new approaches to preparedness. The concept of the polycrisis is another concept that the Global Risks Report has raised, which is speaking to the polycrisis as being made up of cascading and connected crises, which are very much more difficult to deal with than the sum of their parts. And there's limited understanding of how complex emergencies intersect, how we cope with crises at this scale, how we deal with the interconnections, the feedback loops, the lags of multiple systemic risks. So the work that the Emergency Governance Initiative is doing is starting to grapple with the importance of dealing with the compound and intersecting dynamics. And it draws on the principles of disaster management to propose principles as well as pathways to navigate out of complex emergencies. And I found that this was quite a useful lens to look at the situation of eThekwini and to try and distill lessons for strengthening the response. Have I jumped? Okay. So colleagues, you know this far better than me in terms of the challenges and the sort of the socio-demographics of eThekwini. The population is, just under 4 million and growing. I think that, as with many other cities, and I found this quote in some of the documentation produced by the Durban Edge group, doing incredible, data work on economic analysis and so on, but recognizing, the extreme inequality in eThekwini as much as in other cities in South Africa. And this quote saying, it manifests in a two-speed society, one part modern, affluent, technologically advanced, etc., the other part jobless, marginalized, unskilled. And this is where, so many, the tinderbox sits, and really where I think the foundation of complex emergencies in South Africa sits. And when we have disasters like, floods, energy crisis, etc., this is all happening on the tinderbox of our extreme inequality. So, the context of eThekwini and what's working there. I think what I wanted to show here, alongside the pressures and what brings people to eThekwini in search of hope and opportunity, is to recognize that there's fragility in the system, in terms of politics, the coalition government, service delivery backlogs, and what we found quite stark is quite significantly declining capital spend and revenue collection, which is going to really sort of point to a city that's struggling to keep up with development pressures outside of external shocks that come your way. So against this backdrop of inequality, unemployment, service delivery backlogs, we know eThekwini, as other places, is bearing the brunt of multiple disasters. We had the floods, several bouts of floods. We had the COVID pandemic. We had the social unrest. And I think, the impact of these disasters on the city's economy, on the national economy, is significant and is growing due to delays to get infrastructure back on track and the like. So along comes April 2022, and in the research that I did, and speaking to many officials within the city as well as outside the city, social partners, business partners, and so on, I think the one word that came across all the interviews in terms of describing the response to the floods was chaotic. And I think, as part of, when we've been engaging with the city, with the World Bank team, it's well recognized and acknowledged that the severity of the disaster that hit in 2022 would have put any city in the world to the test. I think understanding what happened in eThekwini and the response helps to identify where opportunities for improvements lie. So, well the different disaster management structures that are in place in the city and what those are meant to do. What happened on the ground and what happened during the disaster was the classification from a provincial to a national disaster. And then the layering of different layers of political and technical structures from different spheres to, help coordinate a disaster response. The result on the ground that came from interviews, despite the best and hardest efforts of many, was simply at an overarching level, was challenging coordination between departments, between spheres, between state and non-state actors. Better than anyone, the hours spent in numerous meetings a day, reporting information, the same information to different structures. And while these efforts, while there were efforts made during the emergency to strengthen coordination, accountability, and agility, and I reflect on some of those, we need to recognize that these systems need to be developed, approved, training needs to be done during the planning phases, not during an emergency when lives depend on coordination. So I think, the question that is often asked is, why did these events result in such deep loss and devastation in the city? And I'll try and dig into a little bit of that. So from my analysis of the work that I did and the research and the documentations that I found, there were 4 themes which came across. And the first is that eThekwini is facing a set of external threats that are particularly significant, and they're driven by rising physical and environmental vulnerability, socioeconomic pressures, declining service delivery. While there are strong policy foundations nationally and in the city, there are policy gaps, and there is a need to review those policy gaps, which, in some cases are now 2 decades old, almost written for a different world in the context of complex emergencies. There's also significant weaknesses in policy implementation that need to be addressed, both in terms of service delivery and disaster management. And addressing the weaknesses in implementation requires, as we know, leadership and capacity. It also requires improving transversal coordination and accountability. And then, but at the same time, pressures to strengthen disaster management offer a useful window of opportunity that can be harnessed and should be harnessed. So I'm going to move into some of the findings, and I'm trying to do this as quickly as possible. So there were 4 key findings that came from my work. And the first, in response is that there are significant opportunities to strengthen policy, but fundamentally, we need to recognize that our governance systems absolutely need to gear up for a new category of emergency. We use the declaration of states of disaster, whether for coronavirus, electricity, to try and mobilize the system to coordinate more effective disaster responses, and for other reasons. But while these declarations exist to augment and enable urgent response, institutionally, they're onerous, they're reactive. And do they really help us is a question we need to ask. So despite the disaster declarations, there have been reports by Parliament, by the Auditor General, that the response by sector departments to national states of disaster, and particularly in the context of the floods, lacked the necessary urgency, lacked the necessary agility. It exposed government's inability to move quickly to address post-disaster recovery. So one needs to ask, and this is, speaking to across the spheres of government, are our systems for grappling with disasters of increasing scale fit for purpose? We've this point around the need for a common and standardized system for disaster coordination has come particularly strongly through the World Bank lessons learned exercise, but it certainly bears repeating in the context of complex emergencies where sustained coordination to deal with planning, response trigger events, and critically transitioning beyond the phase of complex emergencies is so critical. So the need to ensure that there's it's recognized that the response to large-scale crises needs to transcend organizational mandates, boundaries, and policy sectors. And yet this is one of the most common challenges facing emergency response. We need organizations to be able to align resources in support of an overarching objective or a common goal, which would be defined in a system of multi-agency coordination. And I think the absence of such a system is a known constraint in South Africa's emergency response. We also need to be careful of this, I say, mind the gap between the concepts of transitions versus disasters versus emergencies, and grapple with the extent to which our policy foundations deal with each aspect. Do we have the policy tools that help us, and give the frameworks for us to transition from one way of being to one, to transition beyond the climate crisis, for example? Do we have the right policy prescripts to deal specifically with large-scale disasters? And then what about these day-to-day emergencies that are slightly beyond, a significant road accident, but which can, if not effectively addressed, become the straw that breaks the camel's back? So these were, there are particular gaps within the existing policy framework, which I think overarching is solid, that really do need to be addressed. And these speak specifically to enabling transversal coordination and sustained transitions beyond. We then come to, I suppose in many cases, the issue of effective implementation, people do say, is a South African parable, which is, our failure, good policy failing to implement. This came up time and time again. And again, colleagues, it's across the board, from national down to local. So, some of the quotes that came out of the interviews: there's never been adequate capacity at national, provincial, or local level to implement disaster policy. One of the biggest lessons this is another quote, is that state capacity to manage a crisis of this proportion is dependent on the investments that a state has made in its ability to govern, to do, and to manage. So implementation failure in service delivery and disaster management, I think, was a significant factor that exacerbated the impact of the 2022 floods. And we need to grapple with, that across the board. We run the risk of getting this lock-in to a cycle of disaster response if we're not ensuring that from planning to response and recovery, we're able to manage and effectively deploy resources and sustain the deployment of resources across each of those phases. Failing to do that keeps us locked into dealing with the next disaster. The reasons for poor service delivery are complex, but I think the state of governance in the country, the undermining of our systems, the failure of leadership where it's needed, all need to be grappled with. Poor implementation of disaster legislation, I grapple with that a little bit here, but, do we have the effective convening authority and capacity to be able to get, to mobilize a response across the systems? And are we effectively integrating disaster management across city plans and budgets? Complex emergencies specifically speak to the need for rapid coordinated action across line functions, organizations, spheres, and sectors. The National Disaster Management Framework states that heads of disaster centers should not be seen as emergency services or line functions, but that their function is primarily management, and that they need to be in strategic offices where they have the authority to convene and command resources. But this is often in South Africa not the case. We also found, a number of cited examples of limited capacity for the scale of disasters that the city is facing. Comparing the number of, staff dealing with disaster management in different cities highlights challenges in eThekwini, although I think we know that there has been appointments recently. But the issue of capacity, and do we have the capacity in the right place where it's needed? Are we retaining institutional memory? Are we recruiting the right combination of operational response and risk reduction? So ensuring that effective implementation of coordination is critical and requires looking at all phases of the disaster management cycle. And quite critically, we need to ensure that politicians understand their place in the cycle. What is the place of politicians versus officials, and how do they work in harmony rather than tripping over each other? So the issue of implementation and grappling with, what underscores the failure to implement, making sure we're not getting locked into the cycle of disaster response, being clear that, who's in charge, and that person in charge or that office in charge or that structure in charge has the ability to coordinate and convene and command resources, and that we have the right capacity in the right place. Another key finding is around the need to manage blind spots. So the work that the Emergency Governance Initiative is doing highlights the need for agile and adaptive governance in complex emergencies. And core to this is managing risk. And in the context of complexity and uncertainty, this means being prepared for the unknown, including events that may result from intersecting risks, as is the case with the polycrisis and complex emergencies. So, we know that during the floods, significant damage to infrastructure occurred and was compounded by gaps in service delivery, such as dealing with stormwater drains, solid waste collection. And these service outages due to damaged infrastructure, prompted civil unrest, protest that, placed significant additional strain on the city's emergency response capacity. So these issues are, some might say, are the tip of the iceberg, and they start to trigger a reactive response. And if we look at this from a systems perspective, we start to understand the patterns that cause these events. So how do we strengthen the policies, the institutions, and the capability to cope with complex emergencies? And what are the tools that enhance agility and adaptivity in the face of uncertainty. So, scenario planning is one, and which really enables leaders to respond dynamically, looking at alternative futures in a complex and unknown system. eThekwini, I know, uses scenario planning, and I've seen some of the outputs of this. And I think the key here is that the scenario planning as a tool and the scenarios are really institutionalized in the city system with the necessary capacity and resources, including, strategic city planning and decision-making processes. Equally, systems for data and information management are critical for effective planning and decision-making, as well as disaster risk management, and this is recognized in our policy. And yet it is one of the most common emergency governance challenges, which it intensifies complex emergencies. So data and analytics, as well as the expertise that's needed to use that data and analytics in tools like scenario planning to help to identify the uncertainties, hidden issues that we're not willing to acknowledge, is critical. And we know that, eThekwini has done some incredible work, in terms of, recognizing that during the floods of 2022, officials were dealing with piles of static information which hindered an agile response to the rapidly evolving needs of the disaster. And during the disaster, the floods impact dashboard, later, the Strat Hub have been incredible tools. And I think a key need, if it hasn't been done, is to look at, how did these tools contribute? What are the opportunities to strengthen them? And how do we institutionalize these tools across city systems where they need to be? So these are incredibly important steps towards enabling data-informed decision-making, but it's critical that the system is reviewed and based on that institutionalized with protocols for integration with other information systems, as well as in other parts of government. And I think, also just to recognize the successes that came from the city's community-based flood warning system, which, has opportunities for replication and strengthening. So one wants to ask what turns a situation of decline around, and, within crises, there are opportunities, and those crises need to be harnessed with the right leadership at a technical and political level to mobilize reform in the system. Crises can also be used to shift the incentives and motivations that help to lead to new cooperation within the system and the creation of new systems and structures. So, I would argue that the challenges, the complex emergency facing eThekwini, South Africa, provides a catalyst for change. And I think the question we face is whether in this period of political instability nationally, we have the leadership that wants to seize this opportunity to build the capacity, to build the alliances and the momentum to sustain these reforms. So this was a quote on the screen, it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a country to understand how to respond to disasters. Until we all understand why climate change is the reality of our time, we will not deal with the magnitude, and we need to start at school. And I think the point here is really just to recognize that this has to be a whole of society approach. The Presidential Climate Commission, as some might know, has driven some very significant whole of society dialogue on, for example, the energy transition, which is helping to shape policy to cope with, different scales of transitions that are needed. It's embraced and worked across government departments, business, labor, youth, academia. And a challenge has often been put out, where the cities are interested in establishing their own city commissions that help to mobilize a whole of society approach to grappling and mobilizing the resources that sit outside of government with cities. So I would put a challenge to the leadership of eThekwini, whether there's not an opportunity here to mobilize the energy that sits across eThekwini through the establishment of a bipartisan city-level emergency commission, building on the experience of the Presidential Climate Commission, that would help to create the space and leadership to drive a city-level transition plan. It'll be critical that the model, is protected from political instability, and that with the right leadership and participation across society, as well as the understanding and agency for urgent transformation that is in place to help drive the change that's needed, whether it's in eThekwini, and it's not just about dealing with April 2022 floods, but it's about mobilizing the resources to transition beyond the complex emergency that exists in a situation of stark, harsh inequality with cascading disasters that are coming at an increasing frequency. So colleagues, last slide, two last slides. The work that I did and the research, the interviews, the workshops and the engagements that I had supported the recognition of a new category of emergency, which is a complex emergency. And it offered recommendations to strengthen policy, implementation capacity, agility, adaptivity, and agency across society. So there were 4 key recommendations with some sub-nested actions that I've put forward. And the first is that we really do need to implement policy reform that seeks to strengthen an integrated multi-agency coordination, accountability and agility across the disaster management cycle. So dealing with the issue of clarifying the mobilization of disaster response structures. How do the different structures intersect and work, from localized incidents to emergencies that require multi-agency coordination, and then emergencies that require declaration. So making sure that we've got the full spectrum of emergencies catered for within the emergency management policies that we work with. An issue came up during the emergency around, and this has been sort of underscored in the World Bank work with the city around the need for a national system of multi-agency coordination that caters for the requirements of complex emergencies. And something that while this is needed at a national level, that eThekwini can really move forward with is the development of an integrated approach to incident command that accommodates existing line department systems. The second recommendation was to strengthen the convening ability and implementation capacity for disaster management, as well as basic service delivery. And I think this speaks for itself, but we need to recognize that effective service delivery is a critical foundation for resilience, for reducing vulnerability and disaster risk reduction. Grappling with the issue of the placement of the disaster management function, capacity, coordination with partners outside of government, inventory of resources, training and capacity building to support the use of such a system is all critical. Number 3, the mainstreaming of tools and systems that enhance agile coordination and emergency preparedness and response is critical. So can you mobilize modeling capacity to update the risk profiles at a city level for the intersecting risks in the context of complex emergencies? Can you institutionalize scenario planning to make sure it's supported by change management and capacity building across line departments? Institutionalize the flood impact dashboard, scale up community-based early warning systems. And then lastly, what opportunities are there to mobilize awareness, understanding, and agency across society in support of the transition out of a complex emergency? And I've got a series of recommendations around what can be done to mobilize a series of whole of society dialogues, engage with the Presidential Climate Commission on this work, and the opportunities to establish city-level climate commissions that are led by the mayor, but there's some bipartisan structure built in there, and critically, how do we make sure that we've got an understanding of how different risks intersect within complex emergency context, and do we have partnerships with learning institutions, research institutions that help to bring that information into our decision-making spaces? So colleagues, just in conclusion, I think an overarching lesson that came from this piece of work is that the public sector capability for implementation, for agility and partnering and learning, which are often not seen as attributes of the public sector, are fundamental to transitioning from complex emergencies. And we need to make sure that we've got the systems in place that enable us that we can implement that enable us to be agile and strengthen partnerships, to mobilize resources outside of government, and to enable us to learn. And I think eThekwini really, in my experience of cities, is head and shoulders above in terms of your recognition of the importance of learning. And I think, you know, drawing that into the necessary reforms, but also the advocacy and lobbying to other spheres of government and policy-making spaces is so critical. So, yeah, I just want to thank you all for your time, and to those who were a part of this research exercise. And I'm very happy to take what questions may come. But Chair, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Let's give Anthea a big round of applause before we take questions. We appreciate the studies that you did as part of this important work for cities. Colleagues haven't written any questions in the Q&A tab, so I think we'll take then verbal questions. Colleagues will verbalize their questions. And I also would like to ask that we extend maybe right to half past one, if possible, because of the constraints we had at the beginning, so that we can allow all colleagues. But of course, we'll manage that and see if we are finishing earlier than that, that's fine. I think just a few comments on my side, Anthea, is that this work that we have done is very important. Of course, there are many other researchers like you in different places, but we do need to find space on how research informs policy, and equally the vice versa relationship, or the equivalent relationship between policy and research agenda. Interestingly, the work that you have done, and the work that cities like ours and many others in our country and somewhere else in the world is a key work that has been recognized very well by national bodies and sovereign state, as it were. Just in a week, starting 5 June to 9 June this year, during the UN Habitat Assembly, there were about 6 resolutions that were taken on the 9th of June at the end of the UN Habitat Assembly, which all spoke to one thing: building resilience in cities and collaboration among different spheres of government. Of course, in other countries, there are not called spheres, there are levels. And then of course, in some occasions, the local government is seen as a perpetual delinquent that need perpetual guidance and you name it, parenting, as it were. Even in our case, where we know that we are equal and we just take different responsibilities, but in times of disaster, sometimes we are then treated as a perpetual infant, or equally a delinquent as well. We're delinquent that need guidance, as it were. But I mean, the spirit should be collaboration. Like you said it, we mustn't waste the great crisis. I would like to open up to colleagues through the show of their hands, and then we take both the comments and equally questions. Let's allow colleagues, and we'll maybe also request that colleagues introduce themselves, indicating that they are PPZ and they work for eThekwini or whichever organization where they are serving the communities. So I think let's get into it, colleagues, then take the questions. I would like to take them in a batches, possibly of 3 or 5, and I do not so for now. Any other questions or comments, colleagues? We also note Lerato Kuboni's comment, and we will work on your recommendations. Spusi, so let's give you the airtime, and I hope your mic can be turned on now, and then you can be able to vocalize your comment or question. Over to you, Bud.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and greetings to everyone. And thank you, Ante, for the presentation. My worry that I have is that everything in your presentation, research presentation, is covered. But my only worry is on 2 matters. One I thought maybe also you will point something on with regards to issues of budget or SCM policy vis-a-vis disaster policy, because you can have a good policy, you can have an agile system and everything in place for issues of disaster, but you know very well from Treasury perspective that everything's boiled down to money or bogged down to money or to funds. I think that is one of the elements that I was expecting, maybe that you will share something with that regard. I got you when you say that there are opportunities to strengthen the disaster policy, but there was nothing also that talked to the issues of SCM policy that also becoming a hindrance to issues of disaster response and so forth. Maybe if you can say something there. Also, I was happy with the presentation on the use of tools to enhance agile coordination. But it is my opinion that you also, with regard to those tools, I was also expecting that you will push harder on digital tools, because when the bridges have collapsed and everything, and there is the infrastructure, as you have seen on the disaster that you had in eThekwini, in nowadays you need this digital technology like drones and so forth. I think also if you can elaborate on those aspects. Oh, I forgot, Chair, sorry to follow your cue. My name is Busiso Madlala. I'm from eThekwini Municipality. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Sbusiso Madlala Sishi. Ante, I think let's take those questions, and maybe I will just add one. So you mentioned also kind of policy gap in terms of how we could possibly apply a differentiated approach between what is termed a disaster by legislation and what is termed as an incident. And also, I mean, that relates to the Disaster Act and relevant prescripts, and is maybe possible confusion as to how what we do in particular incidents, even if it's not necessarily given a status of a disaster, but this as a particular incidents. I think that the other part is you talked about the governance and ability to respond accordingly and seamlessly, and inherently coming from the policy environment. I thought that the policy was clear, but maybe we as public servant apply particular, maybe let me call it myopic view of things, and then eventually want to come up or bring particular non-existing policy objectives through a backdoor, or maybe misread the particular clauses and then misread them because we have ignored to understand the preamble and the purpose why the policy is in place. Over to you, Anthea.
Thanks very much, and a number of key sets of issues. So firstly, I wanted to say, Bongabuso, in response to your first comments, I think, and the extent to which cities can be seen as delinquents. What strikes me, I wear two hats in this space, and I think this goes to where I might have disappointed Busiso a little bit. But I did the research as a student, but I'm also, I work with a city support program at National Treasury, and it's so necessary for cities like eThekwini to be advocates in the national policy space. So, and you do this, but I just wanted to underscore the need to really, ensure that there are platforms and systems for engagement that enable the experiences and the challenges of cities like eThekwini in dealing with these challenges to shape the policy forum. And I often find, sitting where I do in national, and wearing a city's advocate hat, that national policy and national policy making is almost done. There's the kind of perceived intention of it's good for all, but it's done without a true understanding of what it means on the ground, at a local level. And I think we just really have to be very deliberate. And wearing my Treasury hat, Treasury is always trying to ensure that cities have seats at the table and are bringing their perspectives. We look at cities as economic engines, as significant players, and because of that, we need to make sure that you have solid seats at the table where your voices count. So while there might be the sort of perception, and in some cases not just perception, but there are delinquents, cities also need to move into the policy shaping fora with their needs and their priorities, so that these are heard and responded to, failing which we get policy that doesn't speak to city needs. So I recognize where eThekwini does this, and I just think it's so important that you continue to do this, and you continue to reach out even without the support of the city advocate organizations like CSP and Cities Network and others. On SCM policy, Sibusiso, I'm sorry I didn't go into this in much depth. I was rather looking at the issue of governing complex emergencies at a little bit more of a kind of broader level. But when I was speaking to the need for policies that are agile and do enable responses, the procurement. And if you look at the literature on complex emergencies, there's a paper that I can share with you that speaks to the challenges from a financial perspective that complex emergencies bring, and procurement systems, revenue planning, budgeting, the ability to reallocate, the ability to mobilize resources beyond city coffers are all critical aspects. So I think, it's a key issue that you raised. I didn't look at that too specifically, and, but the issue is critical. And then on digital equally, I think it's a little bit maybe more implicit, although not completely hidden, but, the work that I did really recognized how eThekwini had moved very quickly to, establish something like the floods dashboard to enable better use of technology in that space. I think there's opportunities far beyond, as you spoke to, using drones and the like. You can see what's happening in Johannesburg with the Bree Street explosion and the use of drones down some of the gas pipelines to see, what happened. So I think we do need to be much more forthright in using the technologies that are available. From a learning perspective, big data perspective, I think there's, it's vital. And, I see eThekwini with your Strat Hub and your use of data as a pioneer in that space, while there's so much more that can be done. And I think just to say that, while the digital world is critical, and we look at it in other procedures, business processes as well, one needs to recognize that digitizing analog processes requires review. You need to look at reviewing those business processes in order for the effective use of digital tools, whatever they may be. Bongamusa, the issue of the definition of disasters is really a critical one, and it may not be that policy reform is needed, but policy clarity. So while the definition of disasters in South Africa, South African policy speaks to disasters that overwhelm, what it risks doing by focusing on that is causing us to not really ensure that we've got the systems that enable us to deal with the more regular disasters that require coordination but don't overwhelm. And in the context of a complex emergency where we've got increasing pressures coming and increasing uncertainty, being able to be agile and responsive to the disasters that, while they don't overwhelm, can damage and degrade, and they do require a coordinated and effective response. And again, we can let those things slip because if we don't trigger the disaster declaration, we don't get the funds, and yet we have cities that fall apart in the process. So I just think we do there's one of clarity and understanding how to use the policy and what the policy doesn't preclude. So what the policy says, and then what also needs to be done, even though the policy focuses on specific provisions where systems are overwhelmed, but that mustn't let us forget about other scales of disaster that we need to deal with and may struggle with. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anthea, and thank Sbusiso for your questions. Let me check if other colleagues have other questions or comments. While I'm waiting for hands, Anthea, there is another matter you raise on the inadequate and where you said it seems like there will never be or there has never been an adequate capacity to deal with a disaster. And I want just to ask a question that deals with particular nuances between disaster preparedness and disaster response. So in your I don't know if it was covered in this research, of course, but I hope it will. I mean, under the complexities of transitioning in this continuum of preparedness and response, and anything that falls in between. Does this refer only to the disaster preparedness, or it mainly covers response? Where do you think there has never been an adequate capacity? In my humble opinion, is that maybe we are far better on response, but there have never been an intention of investing on adequately on disaster preparedness. Because if we were, even if we experienced the magnitude of what we saw last year, a system can still hold, and we won't suffer the devastating effect that we saw. Despite that, we shown capabilities of bouncing forward faster than what others could have expected. In fact, I think even ourselves. But I mean, where do you see this adequacy? The other part that you also referred to, you're talking about the capacity of disaster management centers, maybe and units. And in my mind, I was asking this question to say, will there be any opportunity where disaster management units, of course, they are not meant for disaster, but they are meant for disaster prevention and management of responses. Will there be any opportunity where we could say they are adequately resourced, or they don't necessarily need to be adequately resourced, but they need to focus on their responsibility and their role of coordination. And then people who necessarily need to be well capacitated so that they take their rightful roles and responsibility are other units and other government departments and other government companies, so that when such incidents happen, government machinery at its best as it exists currently is better coordinated, and then everybody takes responsibility. And then disaster management, no matter how lean the unit may be, but is able to command clear direction following relevant protocols. Could I leave it there? Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, two very important issues. So the National Disaster Policy has this slogan or saying is disaster management is everyone's business, and they're saying management, which is, you know, beyond the response. And so, Bongamusa, I think your point around the capacity to deal with, you know, it's beyond disaster response. It's the full spectrum of disaster management, from planning, preparedness, response, and critically recovery. I think we focus far too much on that immediate response, and the planning, preparedness, and recovery are, you know, we lose momentum, and we lose focus. And, you know, the alignment of resources is one where, you know, and I said in the report, and I think I said in the presentation, the key role of the disaster managers is one of management, and coordination, and the ability to mobilize resources and command resources from other departments, even other institutions outside of government, if those protocols and systems are in place in advance. So, you know, the resources are a challenge. I think if you look at the number of staff that you have in eThekwini compared to other comparative cities in South Africa, you're low on the ground in terms of numbers. But equally, you know, the systems that are needed, the agreements, the understandings, the protocols, the coordination systems formalized to be able to mobilize resources from elsewhere and to play that coordination role across the disaster management spectrum is absolutely critical. And, you know, the issue around resources for coordination, you know, there's a bit of a debate, you know, in some of the national policy spaces around, you know, whether there's sufficient placement, sufficient resources, or whether an organization like the NDMC, the National Disaster Management Center, doesn't need to be placed outside of a line department in a much more in a structure or a department where it can have much greater convening ability and the ability to access resources for coordination. So I think it depends on what you see as the role of the disaster management function, and, you know, and how that's placed in relation to other functions. I mean, if you look at NDMC today, their capacity is, you know, they're incredibly stretched. And what are some of the reasons that result in their capacity to be so thin on the ground? You know, some serious work is needed and thought is needed, but equally recognizing that we don't need bloated bureaucracies. We need agile, we need efficient, we need clear coordination structures. And, you know, we need to be using the resources that we've got wherever they sit. So it's a, yeah, the key points around looking at the full disaster management spectrum, and then, you know, looking at how we get those coordination needs effectively resourced with the right attention to each phase of the disaster management spectrum. Thanks.
Thanks, Anthea. I think we got one hand, and after that, I will propose that we go to close. Over to you, Teresa Suben.
Just wants to find out if if we have a national emergency response plan nationally, and you know, if in the past we used to have early warning systems, but you know, I'm not sure how sophisticated they have grown given the number of disasters that are happening, and you know, whether we can you know, pick up those early warning systems and build it up you know, more strongly. Apart from the natural disasters, we also you know, prone to cyber attacks. and what is our response? Because we've had like a smallish sort of attack at the port, the data place, and we actually was quite shocked about it, and we didn't really get quick responses in terms of how to deal with that. So I mean, there's terrorist attacks as well, and what do we do in instances like that? So from a national perspective, if we have response plans, and then how we can lead into having to prepare local response plans and the demands that come with it in terms of finance and resources and capacity. Thank you.
Go over to it, Anthea.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a key question. So I know at a national level and on a sort of cyclical basis, geared, as you will see in the name, a little bit more towards the sort of seasonal cycles. There are the development of winter and summer contingency plans based on the risk assessments that are being done at a national level, and these need to be cascaded down from national to provincial to local. And the focus on disaster extends beyond national. So whether it's cyber, whether it's public health, whether it's terrorism, these the warning systems and the plans that need to be, the risk assessments that then trigger the plans need to look at the spectrum of disasters or emergencies that are predicted in those risk assessments. They'll then be kind of assigned out to the different line departments based on the line function. So if it's a security issue, it goes to the security cluster. If it's health, it goes to the health department, and natural goes to the assigned line function linked to that risk, and then the plans need to be put in place. But the key issue here is making sure that from national through to provincial, through to local, across the spheres, but then also across these line departments, so both vertical and horizontal coordination for disaster risk assessment, and then the contingency planning. Those systems need to be working effectively and efficiently with the right communications to the right people. So the systems are there. Again, I think it does come down to the implementation, how things are implemented. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anthea. Thank you very much to colleagues. I think let us end it here. I'll just make a few comments and then we'll ask Zama to close for us. There is a poll, colleagues, who would like to hear you. It's a multiple choice. I think it's a voting poll. You just click on the link and then you will be able to make your choice, or you can choose the other part at all of the above. Interesting result, there is none of the above. Anthea, I think the point you raise around the cities taking a leading role in orchestrating for policy changes is really the crux of this discussion, and also other matters that we as the city and maybe local government in general, but specifically the cities, take this responsibility and engage our colleagues with an aim to come up with better policy based on our practice, maybe our experience, but equally based on possibly collective outlook of what the future may be like. So I think that's the important part that we must take as colleagues in attendance here. But linked to that also is how we in our own right create the space for those that are non-state actors in our environment, so that when we engage national and other spheres, we engage knowing that the voice that we are bringing forward is not just the voice of the public servant, but is a voice that has been well canvassed, well debated, well considered by all relevant stakeholders, equally informed by data and research, using the the institution of research that find themselves located in our cities, and even those that necessarily not exist in our city but do particular work that we feel help us to have a logical engagement on particular policy matters that have got implication in our practice and our mandate of delivering services within a sustainable context. The part that colleagues raised around the finances, I recommend to Zama and Phumzile and colleagues from disaster management and equally National Treasury that we recirculate the diagnostic report on disaster risk financing that was done by the World Bank, and then they were looking at the case of eThekwini and the case of the city of Cape Town. The other part that colleagues raise around the how we fully leverage digital transformation and innovation, I think is a very important part. What I wanted just to say there is that in some occasion these are the things that necessarily do not reside within government, but through partnering for success with private sector and organized society, we are able then to leverage the capabilities that do not necessarily exist in government, but exist somewhere else where we are. And in eThekwini, there have been some cases where we were able to use particular technologies that are not owned by government. I mean, specifically drones, owned by private sector and owned by organized society, and they have the requisite pilot licensing to pilot these unmanned drones, and very good, and they were used specifically for South Durban Basin, and we have used them for also other matters, even dealing with crime during festive seasons. We did use drones, and then operating them from one of the buildings in eThekwini. But it was civil society partnering with us and offer their capabilities so that we could able to use that. The last comment I would like to make, because of the interest and the relevance of this matter, Zama and colleagues, I recommend that we consider a full-scale webinar of 3 hours, and then we bring back other matters in that discussion, unlike the BPS, which is meant to be one a knowledge leader dealing with a particular specific matter, but bring a various aspect. And I recommend that we deal with the issue of disaster risk financing. We deal with a matter, as Usiso Ndebele, on how we use their existing planning frameworks and tools to build a resilience. I'm talking about your spatial development framework, your local area plans, your schemes, your building codes. How do we use those as because they are within our power to build a resilience ground up, as it were. I think that we appreciate your time, colleagues. We apologize for the issues at the start, and we are recommending to the senior managers, Zama and the team, that we do revisit this matter, possibly, Zama, as part of our Urban October series of engagement. With that, it has been good to host you by BPZ, as they call me, Umahle Kamlilo, and for now, I hand over to Zama to make the closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zondo, and thank you, Anta, and thank you to those colleagues who have stayed this far. Phumzile, can you share your screen and show us the polling results, just to get a view in terms of how our colleagues are feeling about the question that we have posed? We had asked the question in terms of what areas should the cities prioritize in order for us to deal with these complex issues. Phumzile, can you share your screen? So that we can have a focus on disaster risk reduction programs. And the next one was all of the above. I think it's very important, colleagues, that we focus on disaster risk reduction programs. It's also coupling with building back better, to say that with all the infrastructure that we put, with all the programs that we put, we think about resilience of our city. We think about the sustainability of our city. And maybe in closing shortly, I just want to highlight that all of us here have a role and responsibility around mitigating and reducing the impact of disasters or climate change. With every decision that we take in our planning, in conceptualizing our programs, and in our daily operations. So think about it in terms of, is it adding resilience into our city? Is it collaborating towards making sure that everybody is on board and we are inclusive in all the decisions that we make? As well as in our homes as citizens of eThekwini, we can no longer deny our vulnerability. We have to change our behavior and the cultures around the issues of climate change and disasters. So in that, I will end with the slogan to say that disaster is all our responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility. We all have to put in our heads together and work towards our resilience of the city. Thank you all for attending our session. I hope you had good engagement and it was informative for all of you. See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. The session is formally closed. May you all have a fantastic weekend. See you then. Bye-bye.
Thank you, colleagues. Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.